In the national policy discourse, young women of color, that term, tends to be encapsulated as an umbrella term, right? And we're often referred to as a monolithic group that shares the same experience. However, we know that our research shows that that is not the case. Young women of color have experienced different structural barriers, and as you can see in our research, that is why in every fact sheet, not every group of young women of color was represented. And that is important when we're talking about identities. And this is because young women of color don't live single-issue lives. We are intersectional, we're dynamic, and we are resilient, among a lot of other things. So what better way to start off this panel than to take some time today to reclaim our narrative? Shout out to Maxine Waters. And I want to open this up to Brenda, Isabel, and then Brenda. What does it mean to identify as a young woman of color? And I think you're perfectly spot on, Brenda, when we talk about the roots, because like Nia opened us up, right? When we're looking at this tree, it doesn't matter if we cut off a branch, because guess what happens? It's just gonna grow back. So are you really fixing any of these issues? So taking this back to talking about these root causes, we have to talk about systems of power. And so, like I said earlier, a lot of the outcomes for these young women weren't all the same, right? But there was one thing that kept tracing them back to that root cause. And that root cause was systems of power. And I know that's a very hot word right now, and people use that often. So at CLASP, we took it upon ourselves to really define it in our lens. What does that mean, systems of power? So I'm gonna read you this short excerpt from our report, Our Ground, Our Voices, which is in your folders. It's pretty sure one of the first pages. So this is how we defined it. Systems of power, as we define it, are the beliefs, practices, and cultural norms on which individual lives and institutions are built. These systems of power reinforce white supremacy, patriarchy, and heteronormativity as defining power structures in the United States. They are oppressive, and they define the relationships between marginalized communities and the dominant culture. They also shape norms and experiences within marginalized communities. So this is very important, because with this power structure in mind, there has to be some issues that are not covered. There has to be some things that are falling within the gaps. Thank you, Congressman Presley, for that beautiful, beautiful segue. You set that up so perfectly. And to be completely honest, all of us here are also watching you. And people like you and your predecessors, like the squad and Maxine Waters, and as many other women of color in the back that we might have not learned in history. We are watching you, and you are breaking down these barriers and these paths, and you are creating a pathway for all of us here on this panel and everyone out there in this audience to follow ahead and say, you know what, someone has done it, I can do it too. And that actually leads into this next question to Bao. Because although we have this, we still have way more room, right? We have a lot of work to do. People of color make up 40% of this nation, and there's only 11% of us at all elected offices, right? So there's room for more change here. We need to see more representation. So what changes need to be made to continue to uplift these voices of women of color in policy decision-making process? And at the same time, why is electing more women of color at all levels of government important to address the needs of this population? Bao, you talked a lot about representation, but also looking back at impacted populations, and that's a common thread here at this conversation, right? So we started off this panel talking a little bit more broadly, right? Talked about some federal policies, where some things that are missing from that, but let's go back on the ground. Let's look at things that are already existing, right? Because we have to remember, women of color have always managed to exist and be, and strive in very harsh times, working together and, doing things that have already been in place on the ground, right? And so that's kind of the beautiful thing about our report, right? We were very intentional about what we were going to title this. And so the report is called Our Ground, Our Voices, because again, like Sister Congressman Ayanna Presley said, it's our collective effort that we're doing this, right? And so let's talk about that. Isabel, what are some things locally, right, that could be expanded federally, right? What are some existing things that are already happening on the ground that young women of color are leading that we could really explore and extrapolate federally? So not sure if you guys have been listening closely and reading between the lines, but there's a big thing at the center of all these conversations, and that's economic justice, right? It doesn't matter if we try to tackle one of these structural barriers, or we try to only focus on education, or if we only focus on homelessness or job quality. At the end of the day, what is needed for these communities, right? Because women, we're not alone. We have families. We're in our communities. We're with our partners. The only way that we can move forward is not by tackling just one of these, but all of them in an intersectional way, and that is through economic justice, right? So the solution is clear. We need to find an economic justice solution to these issues that we are facing.